Okay, good morning and welcome. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Corner Local Roads program. We're your New York State LTAP Center. And welcome to the first of our winter series and our 2024-2025 uh, foundational webinars. We'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. We're going to be doing polls and having interaction, hoping you have a little bit of fun and help you figure out what we're going to be doing with other webinars over the course of the winter and even next summer. If you haven't been on one of these before, again, lower left is where you check your audio settings if you can't hear things. We will be using the Q&A, so make sure you open that box up. And if you can't access the polls, that's how you can interact with us as well. You might want to open up your chat pod because in the chat pod, we'll be putting in a couple of times here in the first few minutes, links to the polls and links to the handouts so you don't have to type all those things in. If for some reason you can't access the handout, just put an email in the Q&A, and Amanda and Jody, who are sitting in the background, will take care and get it emailed over to you. Okay, so this particular webinar is worth one professional development hour here in New York State, but only the person who is registered gets credit. We have to have recording. We'll be doing that, and you need to be on for most of the time. It is counted as a course, and if you're from another state, which we'll find out in just a minute, well, you'll need to check with your LTAP center to see if it's worth any continuing education credit. So let's do a little bit of a welcome. Let's talk a little bit about where you're from, what you do, and that helps me figure out what we're going to focus on today. So who do you work for? Do you work for a town, a county, a city or village, state or federal, tribal, and MPO? We added that in after last week's webinar on safety. We'll talk about that in a minute. Consultants, contractors, and the weekend. Let's see what you got there. Okay, so we have quite a few consultants, some town folks, county folks, city and village. That's good. State and fed. That's a good blend. I like that. Okay, cool. Let's now see up. Got a person who works for the weekend. Always like to see that. Let's see where. What is your job? Are you an administrator, a highway superintendent, an engineer, a planner, a field crew, a supervisor of the, field crew? Are you a board member elected? Or are you none of the above? If you put in none of the above, please put it in the Q&A what that is. Okay, so I got someone who's a road crew leader in a village. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so most of you are engineers, but quite a good variety of folks. And then finally, the last thing as you know, we usually ask, where are you from? You get to click on the map in this case, and you can click where you're from. Oh, we have somebody visiting us from Pennsylvania today. Okay. And most of what we're talking about is valid because basics of a good road are pretty much the same just about everywhere, though there are a couple of New York State specific things. Okay, we got a good variety of folks all the way from Buffalo out to the island. Okay, so that's good to see. Now, if you're wondering what other foundational webinars are available, we'll be doing those webinars all through the winter and even next summer, but the ones from now until the end of the calendar year are listed on the screen. Some of them are worth PDHs. Actually, I need to mark that last one, December 17th. That one will be worth a PDH as well. Um, we're also doing a special series right now of road safety webinars uh, as part of a special project with the State Department of Transportation. We've done combating roadway departures, local road safety plans. On Thursday, we'll be doing proven countermeasures, and then next week, improvements at curves. And again, those will be worth one PDH. All of these are recorded and available, though you can't get a PDH for those. But if you want to go back and look at any of the webinars, both the foundational ones and the road safety ones, you can go back and look at those and get copies of the handouts, which have resources available to you. On the back side of today's handout is a list of all of the webinars and online training that we're doing in the 2024-2025 fiscal year that we've got currently going on. Okay, so let's start by having a little bit of fun with the poll system. And, you put up a street sign that says certain, and then what's at the end? What kind of things do we use for road names? What do we call roads if we don't call them a road? A lane, yeah, that's good. I like that. A lane, an avenue, a trail, a boulevard. Okay, a court somebody put over in the Q&A, because again, if you can't access the polls, you can put it in to the Q&A. A highway, a place, Some people want to be on, Park Place, fancy things, but Drive and Street, yeah, those are probably the most common. And, we use different names, but we're really talking about the same thing, whether it's a court or a place or a turnpike or a street. It's a way to get from point A to point B. So maybe more important than the name is why do we build roads and streets? So what do you think? Why do we build roads and streets? Let's see what you come up with for this one. I think this one comes up as little boxes. Yep. Safety. One of the critical things is we are worried about safety. Yeah, we want access for people to get to and from work, get from point A to point B. We need to be able to get to schools. It helps with economic development. Absolutely. It's essentially connections. It's the essentially the network that holds our communities together. And so that's a really important part of it, why we build roads and streets. And yeah, it does allow for faster movement. It's both local traffic and long distance traffic. For the holidays coming up in a couple of weeks, people will be driving long distances. That 100 years ago, people would have been amazed that you could travel from one side of the country on a road driving in less than a week. But, that's really part of why we build roads and streets. But as we think about it, yes, safety is probably going to be one of our considerations because when we're building the roads and streets, we have to worry about everybody getting home safely every single day. And so this is actually a picture of my grandmother, my mom, and my uncle. And it's a reminder to all of us is as we're building the roads and streets, we want to get home every single day. So we hope to see you in some of our road safety webinars that we've been holding on Thursday. Because whether we're talking about the traffic on a roadway, its structure, or its geometry, a lot of it all comes back to getting everybody from point A to point B, but doing so in a safe way. Okay? So let's look at these three primary issues that help us with the why, the connectivity that we've got, and discuss a little bit about some of the things we can all agree upon. At least I hope so. Now, let's start with traffic. Okay. Now, in this particular case, this is at Yellowstone National Park, and the bison were using the road to get around during the end of the winter. It's easier than going through the snow. But who else uses our roads? Who's actually on our roads and streets that we have to move from point A to point B? And again, we've got Q&A available. Yeah, emergency management, firefighters I see over, and police over on the Q&A. Bicyclists, pedestrians, trucks, okay? People, whether they're walking or biking, okay? The public transportation, yeah, motorcyclists. Wildlife do actually use the road, surprisingly, quite a bit, especially at certain times of the year. You have to be careful of that. Okay, let's see. I'm not seeing one that I was looking for. I do see emergency transports, moving things from point A to point B, tractor trailers and trucks. Yep. Might be an electric vehicle. Might be farmers. Yeah, farmers getting from point A to point B. Okay. Um, the Amish and the Mennonites. Again, anybody moving from point A to point B, they like roads. What I don't see on this list, but it's actually pretty important, is how do your kids get to school? There we go. There's school popping up. Yeah, school buses and city buses. So again, think of all the different users of roadways. And what we've done when we look at our road system, we said, roads have different primary purposes, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in just a minute. But if you think about it, there's functional classifications, functional systems. Just like in your body, all the veins and arteries, there's functional parts of it. So there are principal arterials. These are the main, most important roadways. Okay, the interstate system obviously is principal arterials, but every community has certain roads that are the most critical roadways. These are the main lifeblood of the commerce within our community. There'll be minor arterials, maybe not as critical, but they'll still be pretty important to getting people from point A to point B. And the primary focus on most arterials is movement. Okay? Movement and safety, those are the primary two things. And there can be a conflict because the second tier of roads, where we collect the traffic from the local system, sometimes almost acts like an arterial. And of course, the local roads is where we live and work and go to school. there definitely can be a conflict where we've got a road that's trying to serve multiple functions at the same time, because while the arterial's primary job is movement, the local's primary job is access. And speeds typically are lower and volumes are typically lower, but when you get a high volume local road that acts like an arterial, it can create a conflict. I mean, we like to joke and say that everybody starts and finishes every trip, and it's not really a joke, it's true. They start and end a trip on a local road. Where they live is a local road, even if it's classified as an arterial or a collector. If people could do so, they would put a driveway on the thruway. And then they'd complain, of course, the next day because people were speeding in front of their house. But that's a reality we have to deal with. Now, if you're interested in knowing what the classification is for your system, you can go online and just type in functional classification, New York State DOT, and up will pop the New York State DOT functional classification viewer, and you can actually get a sense of what the federal and state governments are classifying the roads for. And by the way, there's some funding that's available for the arterials and collectors. Now, you could also look at very low volume road functional classifications. In this particular case, this is a standard that is now actually supported by AASHTO. And for low volume, under 400, some people say under 2,000, we'll argue about that particular number. But the idea is you use land classification to decide the purpose of the roadway. So is it residential? Is it commercial? Is it agricultural? And that can be very helpful when it comes to trying to figure out your priorities and where you're going to spend your money. Now, one of the more critical things we need to know is traffic. And traffic volume, you can put out counters and tubes, and they have ones that are visual these days. All kind of fancy ways to estimate traffic. But I got a couple of rules that actually work pretty well and can be used to check to make sure your tools are working right. So let's look at a rural area. The busiest time of day typically is everybody going to work in the morning or everybody coming home from school and work in the afternoon. And it might be different in your community. More commonly, it's in the afternoon because everybody wants to get home from work. But in a lot of communities, it can be in the morning because everybody's due at a particular plant or all the government offices open at a certain time. You probably know when that is in your area. During that busiest hour of the day, in a rural area, you're going to get about 15% of the traffic. Okay? In an urban area, it's about 11% of the traffic. Okay? So a little bit less. There's not as much of a peak with the morning and afternoon commutes, surprisingly. But if you want to know traffic then, you could go out for 15 minutes, multiply that value by 4 to get an hour count, and divide it by that percentage. And that would give you an estimate of the traffic. You could also figure out a factor, an F factor if you wanted to, and again, rounded, you could take the count for 15 minutes and multiply it by 27. That gives you your rural count. You could take the count in an urban area and multiply it by 36. That would give you your urban count. What does this mean practically? Well, in a rural area, if you think about it, if you had one vehicle per minute, that would be about 400 vehicles per day, which is that cutoff point we talked about that a lot of people think of as very low volume. So 400 vehicles a day. In an urban area, it of course would be a little bit larger, okay? So if you had one vehicle a minute, you'd have about 600 vehicles a day. And of course, in suburban areas, it's going to be between the two. Surprisingly, this is pretty accurate, within 5 or 10%. And if you put out a counter and you see a really low number or a really large number compared to what your 15-minute count tells you, maybe something's wrong with the tubes or the counter. And it's a quick way to check before you spend the money and the time on the fancy tools. And it's a good way to estimate traffic. Now, in terms of what this means practically is, our functional classifications, those arterials take more traffic volume, even though they're a relatively small portion of our overall network. Okay? So look at the principal arterials. These are the interstates, the national highway system. It, depending on the state, can be from 40 to 65% of the total traffic volume. It's only 5 to 10% of the length. And especially in rural areas, the traffic volumes are much higher on the arterials compared to the lengths. And again, in the local system, it may only carry 10 to 30% of the traffic volume, but it's carrying, in terms of centerline mileage, it's 65 to 80%. And when we're trying to manage that, trying to budget for that, that can be a bit of a challenge for us because Obviously, everything gets paid for directly or indirectly with taxes, and there's just a limited amount of funds. Now, in terms of goods transported by truck, the percentage of goods transported by truck does vary, has varied some from one year to the next, but on average, on the whole, pretty much it's about 70% of all goods are on a truck at some point during their delivery cycle. They may be brought in by ship to the United States, they may be sent by pipeline, but at some point the gasoline is put into a truck and taken to the gas station. The microwave that was shipped overseas is put on a train, but then put on a truck to be dropped off at the local uh, Walmart or Kmart or store that you're going to buy it from. So the idea is most goods transported by truck. Now let's do a little bit of a close-up here, just as an example, what you might be able to do in your own community. This is the Cornell Central Campus. All of the roads maintained by Cornell are considered local, okay, even though they are pretty busy in some cases. But you can see there are arterial roads, there are collector roads, and there are local roads. And again, there'll be different definitions of what these mean, at least in your own mind, but it's a good way to think about managing your system. One thing you may want to do, especially if you work on the government side, is go back and look at those classifications. They haven't been updated in a lot of cases, and maybe it's time to think about that. If you've got a road that really is acting more like an arterial, you might want to get it on the list, and vice versa. You may have a road that's really more local. It does change funding, both for good and for bad. You really want to have it in the right spot because if you're a federal aid road, you may not be eligible for certain kinds of emergency relief, for instance. So something to keep in mind. Now, the other thing I want to talk a little bit about is structure. What's the structure of a pavement? Well, that has to do with why we build pavements. It goes back to the issue that everything comes in by truck. Now, we're trying to spread the load out so we don't overstress the subgrade, but not from a single pass. And we certainly don't want a road that looks like this. This is a picture from ARTBA, and it's what roads look like a little over 110 years ago outside of urban areas. Pretty poor, okay? And now I've seen roads that look like this today. The big difference is cars are a little bit different, and nobody wears hats anymore, but still pretty poor roadways. And what's happening with roads is they're failing in fatigue. Much like you're sitting here going, when's he going to ask us a question? And you're bending your paperclip back and forth. It's the same concept on a road, but instead of it failing by bending the paperclip, it's bending the road itself. So this is a video that was produced by our partners in Minnesota at their LTAP Center through their Local Roads Research Board. And it's part of a longer video. It's available from us, and it shows what happens to a road under a truck. So you can actually see it bend. Watch the two green dots, and you can see the pavement actually flex. Now, this particular road was built to fail, and they did a really good job of having it fail quickly. With a high water table, they were researching failure. So in this particular case, it only took 81 passes for the road to look like this. So 81 passes is not a good design for our road system, but for research, it was great. But if you got a road that does this to you, you probably got a base problem or you've got a problem with water. So think about that when you're trying to think about making sure your road has enough thickness, has enough structure. And think about the critical locations on the pavement, okay? You're going to have critical places where there's going to be damage right underneath the wheel due to cracking, due to the fact that there is the high pressure tire causing cracking going on. You're also going to have a more critical problem on the top of the subgrade. You don't want to overstress the subgrade. That's going to lead to rutting, and rutting is bad as well. So keep that in mind. And we can do, and we have done, whole webinars and classes on designing the pavement, but build the road to handle the load. Now, what does this mean in terms of the roadway itself? Well, what I'm really caring about is the damage of a truck versus the damage of a car. A truck weighs about 10 times more than a car, a fully loaded dump truck, but it doesn't just do 10 times more the damage. It does about 4,000 to 6,000 times the damage. If I had a fully loaded dump truck and I had a whole bunch of cars, it would take about 4,000 passes of the cars to equal one pass of a truck. And especially if you got a fairly low volume of traffic, you got a pretty high percentage of trucks. So the thickness of your road, you're driving it by the number of trucks, the thickness. Okay? In terms of geometry, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that's usually driven by radius for trucks, but the number of cars and how the cars are getting around. So we have to balance these two things. And of course, at the wrong time of year, even a few truck passes can do even more damage if the roadway's in thawing conditions and it's weak. Now, I'm not talking about something like this where you've got a single supersized load that is putting a lot of weight onto a roadway. Something like this is the digester in Iowa. You're going to have to design this particular one very specifically, okay? Um, that's a one-off. Normally, we try to build the road to handle the loads, and we have certain minimums that we might want to put in. And as part of that, we care about the surface material that we have for the roadway. Now, this happens to be a wooden street in Philadelphia, okay? It's actually wood blocks that have been placed and put in place and chinked in Philadelphia. But what other surface materials do we actually use on our roadway? What kind of surface materials? Let's see what y'all come up with. Concrete surfaces, brick. I got someone put stone over onto the left. Mm-hmm. Asphalt, gravel, cobbles. Yeah. Surprisingly, across the entire United States, gravel is still the most common surface type. Okay. In fact, we're actually depaving some roadways. We're taking them from asphalt back to gravel. Second by far is asphalt. Some people call that a chip seal. Some people call that uh, bituminous pavement. Um, Different words are used, but essentially, what is the binding agent? What holds the materials together on the surface? Is it going to be concrete, asphalt, or the material itself, the gravel material itself, the clays and the fines and stuff like that? You can use warm mix, you can use cold mix. There's still hot mix being sold, though most of our asphalts these days are warm mixes and cold mixes. But think about the different surfaces that you've got on there. The reality is, whatever you put on the surface, though, if you're going to have long-term problems, it's probably the base underneath that's the real culprit in this particular case. This had been a good gravel road for years. But the traffic volume started to get up, and once the traffic gets above 100, 150 vehicles per day, it really is a good idea to think about putting a surface on it. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to take it from a gravel surface to a gravel base by putting a chip seal on it or covering it with asphalt or even concrete, you got to make sure the base is clean enough. If you don't do that, you're going to have a problem because water that used to evaporate now actually builds up pressure and can blow your roadway apart. So think a lot about before you just pave over a gravel road. And oh, by the way, if you wanted to depave and take a road back to gravel, you can't just take the asphalt off because now if that had good gravel for being underneath the asphalt, it doesn't have enough fines and it wears away. So these are all things you need to think about for the basics of what makes up a good road. Now, obviously, the most important thing is drainage. The second most important thing is drainage, and the third most important thing is drainage when it comes to road building. Now, a flood like this is from a hurricane, sometimes can be very hard to solve, but there are things we can think about. How do we handle the big storms? Can we shunt the water off to one side versus the other rather than having that water run right down the road and rip it apart? Because while it's not going to be cheap, we at least know what we have to do here. We're going to have to rebuild this particular roadway. But we want to rebuild it right so it can handle the next storm. Now, in terms of maintenance, um, we're a huge fan here of what's called asset management and pavement management. In fact, one of our webinars, the one on the 17th that I had marked with the PDH, that's going to be on pavement management. The idea is to keep good roads in good shape and pick the right repair to fix the problem. This particular road, no, this would not be a good repair to do crack repairs. A good rule of thumb, if you spend that much time to fill it up, you might as well just make a zebra. It's a waste of money. It didn't do any good in this case. They were spending $30,000 a year on crack repairs. Didn't really help. You've got to pick the right maintenance technique to solve the problem, to keep the good roads in good shape. Because what it says essentially is, if you spend $1 on a proper crack repair, on a chip seal, or maybe even an overlay at the right time, you can keep that road from deteriorating and not have to do something more extensive like a reconstruction or a rehabilitation, which could cost you $4 or $5 per square. So again, the concept behind any pavement, design and maintenance, is keep good roads in good shape, and maintenance is always cheaper. It's the same thing with our car, the same thing with our house, and yet we all get easily lulled into the idea that, I can get to it later. I can push maintenance off. Please don't do that. That's going to help your roads and help use the tax dollars as wisely as possible. Now let's talk a little bit about the geometry of the roadway. Okay? Now, roadway geometry is driven obviously by traffic, but what does the public need? Okay? Now, I'm going to give you three choices for your road width, and I'm going to ask you to think about which one, if you could only pick one, which one would you choose? Okay? Would you like a 10-foot wide road? Would you like a 22-foot wide road? Or would you like a 36-foot wide road? Okay? Now we're going to vote. If you could only pick one, which one are you going to vote for? Let's see what we come up with. So about 80% of you have voted to 22 feet. If you can only pick one, you're going to do 22 feet. About 20% of you have voted for the wider road. Okay? None of you voted for 10, though I did see a couple people start there, but that's okay. Here's the reality, and this is actually something I've seen a little bit too often. We really need to have a variety of choices of widths. It might even be as changing as little as just a few feet, because you really want to change the width to handle the situation. You know, if it's just a gravel road that serves just a few houses and there's nice connectivity and it's not being used by emergency management other than in a pinch and maybe the garbage truck, 10 or 12 feet might be more than adequate. Even though it's really almost one lane, people can sneak around each other in a slow speed. Um, you start getting into higher speeds, maybe collectors, you're probably going to need at least an 11-foot lane. That's 22 feet. Now, that doesn't count your shoulders. You might want wider shoulders in certain situations, but 22 feet. But again, there are maybe roads where 20 is adequate. You need 24. And finally, if you're allowing parking, if you've got buses, if you want to put in a bike lane, um, you're absolutely going to need the wider width that's available. In fact, if you come to visit Ithaca, you'll notice as you get into the city center, roads get a little tight because when the city was laid out by Simeon DeWitt, he decided he wanted to restrict and sell more land, so those roads are a little bit tight, and it's a tough challenge for the city to have to deal with that. So in terms of what does the public need? Well, what the public really needs is a good set of plans, a good set of standards. And one of the links in the handout that's available is a link to some standards that we put up on our website that you can use as a starting point. And then you should modify them for your own conditions. We really want a variety of choices. Now, we said safety was our primary reason in a lot of cases for what we're doing on a particular roadway. And so in this case, we want to think about stopping sight distance. Stopping sight distance has two components to it. It has the perception reaction distance, i.e., how long does it take you to put your foot on the gas? Excuse me, brake. Gotta make sure you hit the brake. And then how long does it take for the vehicle to actually stop? Okay? So there's a distance if you're going down the road before you actually put your foot down. Okay? Most people, that reaction time is about 1 to 1.5 seconds. Okay? Now, there are people who are much faster. The really, really good ones who are super, super fast reaction times play sports like baseball and NASCAR because they have incredibly fast reaction times. But most of us, 1 to 1.5 seconds, if we don't know something's happening. So we can help improve the reaction time by good signage. We can help the reaction time by having consistent, good geometry. But we actually usually our design time is 2.5 seconds. And the reason we design for 2.5, even though most people are a little faster than that, is we're trying to include about 85% or the majority of people. Because as people get older, they tend to have slower reaction times. Or younger drivers have incredibly fast reaction times, but they don't recognize the issue and put their foot on the brake for a longer period of time as well. So 2.5 tends to be a pretty good conservative value for how long it takes to actually put your foot down on the brake, and then you have to actually stop the car. So the stopping sight distances will vary quite a bit. Now, more recently, the latest standards from AASHTO, and AASHTO stands for the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, which is why we usually just say AASHTO, they put in something called the decision sight distance. And I like this concept. And what that says is, you know, those reaction times assume there's no distractions, assumes there's nothing around you that's creating things that you have to be focused on. So let's add a little bit of extra time depending on the situation. So in a rural area, just a little bit extra time, maybe we'll add another quarter of a second. So our decision sight distance might go up a little bit by, 10% or so. But in an urban area, especially for, low speeds, we're like 30 miles an hour, which is very common, it might double or more in terms of the length that you need for making decisions before you can put the brakes down. So that's actually not a bad way to think about it from a safety standpoint, the decision sight distance concept. So as you're thinking about redoing something, putting in a roundabout, redoing a traffic light, figuring out whether you've got good sight triangles, you may want to think about that decision sight distance. Okay? Now, a good rule of thumb is you want to be able to see about 7 seconds if you're sitting in an intersection, looking left and looking right. That's a pretty important thing to think about and can actually help if you're not totally sure. But of course, I said earlier, signs help. Good signs help. Bad signs, well, not so much. In the Q&A for me, tell me what you would do here. What would you do? Tell me in the Q&A, type in the Q&A box, what should be at this particular location? We got a bridge closed. Remove the sharp bend. Well, there is a sharp corner there, um, but that's really not going to work because what doesn't it tell the driver? Yeah, you need a proper detour signage. It doesn't tell them whether they got to turn left or they got to turn right. It just says sharp bend. Um, Really, you want a proper signage. Now, it should be, it should be orange background with black lettering and symbols. That should be the color because it's a detour. Okay? Technically, that should be the color. And then the speed is determined by the same way we do a curve study. If all you've got in your stock is yellow and black, go for it. I would much rather have good yellow and black signs than putting signs up that actually confuse the public. Okay? And again, I'm just showing this in a schematic form. You're going to need to lay that out and get your proper spacing. That advanced sign is going to have to be back up the road at the stopping sight distance, maybe even the decision sight distance, to give people time to react and make that curve safely. Okay? But yeah, should theoretically be orange and black, but again, put up things that help the public. And by the way, that sharp bend sign wasn't reflected, so at night it was really hard to read, even though it looks pretty bright during the day. Now, in terms of our horizontal alignments, remember, we're moving vehicles around, and at intersections, we have to worry about turning radius and getting around the corners. And you may see things like a mini roundabout. They can be effective, but think about all the vehicles that are getting through there. If it's all cars, that's one thing. But what if there's trucks? Can you get the fire truck through there? Is there commerce? If there's commerce, you may want to think about a different radius or a different design. I'm not opposed to these things. I think they have their place. But again, think about all the users. And by the way, in an urban area, you also have to think about the bicyclists, the pedestrians, people with the grocery carts, people who are walking their strollers. Keep everybody in mind. In a more rural area, we actually want to super elevate the curve. So it actually allows us to go around the curve a little bit faster, a little bit safer. We want to transition properly into those curves so that people have good control. And we want to make sure it's not too steep, especially in the winter when we get snow. And I think we'll get snow eventually. I'm hopeful. But I actually am one of these guys who actually likes snow. I know. Weird that I am. Now, in terms of laying everything out, we got to worry a lot about intersections, curves, and intersections where most of our crashes occur. There are two of the three focus areas that the Federal Highway Administration has. You want to think about intersections from the standpoint of simple geometry is better. You get a complicated intersection like this one, which is really three intersections all right next to each other. Sure, after a while you get used to it, but what about people who are visiting? What about people who don't know that particular area? Does that create confusion for them? Who's got priority? What are the signs? What's the traffic control? Where are the pedestrians walking and should be marking for them? Okay, so all little things that we need to keep in mind before we spend, a lot of time. Redoing an intersection can really help, but think about that traffic. Now, in terms of vertical alignments, there are controls for vertical alignment, minimum and maximum slopes that exist in most design standards. We don't want it too steep because it can be hard to get up and down a road. This particular road, the grade of the road is 18%. And on a cold, wintry day, that can be a really hard thing to do. In a mountainous area, you may have to do that, but try to avoid that when you can, especially on your more, higher volume roadways, because obviously there's issues with the vertical alignment being too steep. Also, by the way, in a flat area, you really still want some grade. A perfectly flat road sounds great, but doesn't drain very well. You really want to have a pitch. And your ditches, by the way, may even have a different pitch to carry the water away from the roadway. Next time you're driving on an interstate or a main road and you notice how the ditches get further away as they get deeper, hard to do with our right-of-way issues we have, but something to think about. Drainage is going to be key to moving that water. And of course, when you combine these two things together, you get horizontal and vertical curves that can create issues. You may want to widen the inside of a corner. You want to think about going around and over a hill. There's a visual trap. People don't necessarily get that correct in their head. So something to think about when you're combining these curves together. And we're actually going to be talking about in this road safety series, not this Thursday, but next Thursday, things we can specifically do with curves. So hope to see you there and you can join us. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the details for widening, dealing with the edges, making sure you have good clear zones. Okay. So everybody get ready to raise your hand. Okay. You're driving down this roadway and your tire blows out and you're going to lose control. I have a chance I can pull off to one side or the other. Okay. How many of you raise your hand if you're going to pull off to the right? Raise your hand if you're going to pull off to the right. Okay. I'll give you a sec. Okay. Obviously, in a real situation, you would have literally just a second or two. Okay, so now I'm going to magically lower everybody's hands. I got 10 of you who raised them. Now I want everybody who would have gone to the left, raise your hand. Everybody's going to go to the left, raise your hand. We got slightly more going to the left. And as is the American way, not everybody voted. Okay. By the way, um, sounds like a great idea to swing to the left. But Jeff Scott took this picture. And when you blow it up and you look carefully, you'll notice that on the left side, there's a small problem. There's some tree stumps. They're a little hidden in the grass. And I've seen cases where the grass actually completely hid the stumps. And you may not find that stump until you hit it. This is a deadly fixed object. You hit this with any speed, and I mean any speed, your chances of a serious or fatal crash goes way too high. So if you're taking down trees, make sure you get them flush with the ground. Anything more than 4 inches above the surface can snag a vehicle and create problems. So take those trees all the way down. In some respects, a tree stump is actually more dangerous than a tree itself. Both can be risky, but think about protecting it. Think about having a nice clear zone, a consistent clear zone. And how wide does that clear zone need to be? We're not advocating the 30 feet you may see in some of the literature, except maybe on the principal arterial system. But you want to, as wide as you can get consistently, and then focus a lot on your corners or places where it's more common for people to go off the roadway, and give people a safe space to pull off. Okay? Now, Again, in terms of geometric standards, you should have them. You should adopt a geometric standard. You should adopt a geometric standard for several reasons. One of them, of course, is communication. Communication with the board, communication with the public, consistency, so all of your roads have a consistent standard. That really helps. It also improves safety, and of course, liability. If you don't have a set of standards that you follow and something happens, like a crash, and you wind up in court, it's going to be what standards are you using? And if you don't have a set of standards, someone may try to hold you to something like the AASHTO Green Book or the New York State Department of Transportation's Highway Design Manual. Both very good standards, and for high volume roadways, ones we would recommend that you use. Um, but you start getting into a low volume road under a couple of thousand vehicles per day, there are other standards that are out there. So AASHTO put out something called the Geometric Design of Low Volume Roads. It can be used for roads up to 2,000 vehicles a day. Um, Raise your hand if you have no roads above 2,000 vehicles a day. Okay, only a couple of you. Now raise your hand if more than half of your roads are under 2,000 vehicles a day. Yeah, a few more of you. These are standards that were developed actually from a standard here in New York State that had the concept that we need to build roads and have standards that match actually how roads are functioning and working today. And then people did risk analysis and realized, those standards actually work for low volume roads. Because if they're consistent, they match what people actually use, they can actually be just as good from a safety standpoint and still provide connections without overly being, expensive. So these are things to think about. You can develop your own local standards, but I'll tell you right now, if you can tie them back to a national or state standard, that really is going to help you when you get into court. So I would keep that in mind. Our standards, the one that's linked on the handout, that standard is a great starting point, and it links to the AASHTO and standards and the New York State standards as well. Because you're going to have probably both. Maybe for different types of roadways, you might have to have slightly different standards. Okay? So let's take our last 15 minutes together. We'll obviously do our little PDH questions at the end, but let's talk about the 10 commandments for good roads. Okay? Now, we could argue about the top 10 list. And I've done this in a drop-down top 10 from 10 to 1. I've done this as a just 10 starting at the top, which we're going to do today. Um, the key is there's certain things we need to think about that makes a good roadway, okay? So I'm going to ask you for each of these to throw in some samples to me in the Q&A. So get your Q&A buttons ready to go. Number one, we want to get water away from the roadway. This is a picture we're allowed to share. We give credit to Mr. J. Olson, and it says drainage is critical for roadway design. Ducts are an indicator of poor drainage. Obviously, if you've got water standing on the roadway, that's a problem. Why is water standing on a roadway a problem? Yeah, you got to build a good base. What does water do to the strength of the roadway? What does water do? Yeah, it leads to freezing and thawing. It weakens the road base. It makes it softer, like we saw in the video. You got to get the water away. Interestingly enough, I'm not opposed to water. In fact, I want some water. I don't want to get rid of all the water. I really probably should say get the excess water away from the roadway, because you actually need some water when it comes to compaction. You need some water to help hold it together. But yeah, too much water reduces the strength. You want to build on a firm foundation. Now, this particular picture is due to an earthquake. It's not the way the road was built. Earthquake came along and moved it. But you really want a good foundation, which means you really want the best base material possible, because you can't really change the subgrade. The native material that we build on is whatever it is. And most of us can't afford to dig out enough to put in a whole new subgrade. We have to build the road on top of what's already there. But you got to have a firm foundation, which means spend money on the base. So If anybody knows in the Q&A, tell me how much does it cost for gravel right now? Base gravel, base quality gravel that you could buy. How much do you pay per ton per cubic yard? Let's see what y'all come up with. Lots of money. Lots of money. But it's got a number behind that. $45 per cubic yard, 55 a ton, 40 a ton, 20 a cubic yard, 7. Quite a variety. Okay. So now we're going to clear those. How much do you spend for asphalt concrete per ton? We'll make it warm mix slash hot mix. How much do you pay for that material? 100, 85, 125. Again, looking at the numbers and the names, you're spending a lot more money on the asphalt. And yet the base gravel is doing the majority of the work, especially on a low volume road. So why don't we spend more money on the base and spend less money overall by getting a really good, firm foundation? Oh, and by the way, when things occur and they fail, if it's failure in the surface, I can do a mill and fill. I can fix the surface relatively easily. But if it's in the base, if it's in the subgrade, I got to dig it out. It costs a lot more money. It's the lower part of that curve. So make sure you build on a firm foundation and use the best materials available. Okay? And do it right. There's no point in spending tons of money on really good quality, in this case, paint striping materials, if you're not going to do it right. We all talk about QA, QC, and it doesn't stand for quit asking and quit checking. It stands for quality control and quality assurance. Okay? And yes, I know, budgets are a challenge. Heck, we got a big budget fight going on here in the city of Ithaca. Budgets are a big issue. Nobody wants to pay any more in taxes. But what people really don't like, and I've seen this going around the state and even the country, what they really don't like is they don't like what they call wasteful spending. If they're going to send their taxes in and they're being used well, most people are like, well, they're using my dollars okay. I don't like it, but I'm okay with it. But when they think it's just being poured into a hole and it's being a waste of money, no, no, no. You got to do it right. It goes back to that old cartoon or ad, excuse me, for oil filters. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. So when you're buying your gravel, uh, what kind of gravel do you buy? What's your spec? Throw in the Q&A. What's your spec for your gravel? See what you got. Let's see what y'all come up with. Crusher run 1 and 2, New York State DOT Type 2. You pick for angular material, item 304. Yep, Type 2. Yeah, I figured most of you would say Type 2 or 304. Look carefully at the title and the spec. Next time you open it up, open the book up. Type 304 is a sub-base material, where the state is putting down a big thick layer of asphalt, a thick layer of base asphalt, and then they're putting down their granular layer. If your asphalt thickness is only 2, 3, or 4 inches, your gravel layer actually needs to do more of the work. You need better gravel than the state does, because the state thickness is typically minimum 8 to 10 inches of asphalt. So you need better gravel. There is a standard, it's 667. It's a little cleaner, okay? A little less fines, a little better frost heaving issues. Spend a little bit more money on the best material available. When you do cold patching, buy the better stuff. Put it in properly. Compact it well, okay? There's no point in spending all the good money on stuff and not compacting it well. You really want to compact really, really well. The better you compact it, the longer it's going to last. So let me just ask you to raise your hands. Yeah, I see it already in the Q&A. Someone's jumped ahead of me here. No throw and go. Perfect description. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Not that if you're doing it, because I'll be nice. I don't want anybody to, say this. But how many of you have seen in the last year people out patching where they throw the stuff in the hole and they hit it with a shovel? Just raise your hand. How many of you have seen where they just throw it in the hole and they don't actually compact it? Yeah, over half of you. Yeah. That's called throw and go. It is a complete waste of money. It doesn't last. Traffic does not compact it. It comes right back out of the hole. If you'll just roll your truck tire over it, buying the better quality polymer-based patches, you can get 80-90% survival rate for the season. Or better yet, box it out and do a semi-permanent patch when the plants are open. And make sure you compact it really well. The better the compaction, the longer it's going to last. When you backfill your culvert pipe, put in thin lift, use the proper equipment. This particular little compaction tool, how thick do you think you can actually compact asphalt with that little guy? Throw in the Q&A, how thick of a lift do you think you can actually compact asphalt with that? Let's see what y'all think. 4 inch, 1 inch, 2 inch. Yeah, you got the idea. Really thin, much thinner than you think. That's good for a, final surface, but really you need to have a lot more vibration and a lot more weight. You actually get more compaction from your truck tire, which has over 100 psi, than you're going to get from that little guy right there. So in a lot of ways, get a good roller, or if you have to, use your truck tire. And for throw and roll patching, that's what we actually recommend. Designed for winter maintenance. Like it or not, oh, I must have stolen that from someone else's thing. It has a page number on it. I apologize for the page number, but designed for winter maintenance. We haven't seen much winter. Last winter wasn't that's great. This winter, we don't know yet. We haven't seen any snow, at least down by us. But like it or not, winter maintenance is going to drive a lot of our activities. It's going to drive our crew sizes. It's going to drive what we have to think about for plowing and getting rid of snow. And we will get snow events. Okay? We'll get events like this is up in Oswego County where, we don't get inches, we get feet of snow per night. Design your roads for the winter maintenance and think about the traffic that has to use those roads. The cars, the school buses, maybe the bicycles and pedestrians. Maybe you have Mennonite and Amish. Do you change your operations in the winter because of that? If you're in an area that's got ski resorts, do you have to think a little bit differently about handling winter maintenance? Okay? So these are things that you think about a little bit. So raise your hand if you think, let me lower your hands first. Hang on, let me lower your hands. How many of you think you have enough plows right now to handle this winter? Raise your hand if you have enough plows to handle this winter. Well, that's good. That's good. That's going to drive a lot of what you do. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why there's the big concerns about some of the electric vehicle stuff, because if you're thinking about winter maintenance, you need to have equipment that can handle and be ready for the winter. Okay? And when you're designing your roads, your geometry and your thickness, design for the traffic loads and the volumes. As I said earlier, build the roads to handle the loads. Okay? Now, obviously, this is a very low in terms of traffic loading, but in terms of volume, at least for one creature, there's real importance to be able to get across this road safely, and we have somebody doing their good deed for the day. Okay? Helping the ducks get across the road. But more commonly, we have thin roads where we just don't have enough thickness. So you could do posting, and we're okay with posting the roads, but you probably want to think about doing only seasonal posting. Post it when you really need to post it. Don't try to leave it up year round. You can't stop local traffic anyway. And long term, we need to build the roads for the vehicles who are using the roads, whether it's farm vehicles, trucks, school buses, cars. Okay? 8 tons, not going to get a lot of vehicles down that. But again, you're still going to get that local traffic. You're still going to get that local delivery. Okay? Pave the roads only when they are ready. Okay? This particular road was paved the day after I took the photograph. It's not a good candidate for crack repairs. There's water still coming out into the roadway. Make sure you've taken care of the drainage. Make sure you're ready to do the work. Okay? Don't pave too early. Don't pave too late. Watch the weather. When you put down a chip seal, you need a month or two to really get it to cure out, get all the water out of it. That's why we typically like to stop by Labor Day. Yes, this year it's been warm for longer, so we're going to get away with it. But what happens if we get an early cold snap? And in the spring, we like to get out there early, but make sure the ground has warmed up. Not just the air temperature, but the ground's temperature is ready. Make sure you're ready to pave. Seasonality matters. Make sure the base is in good shape. Spend the time and the effort and build from the bottom up. Always think about what's underneath and where's the water. And if you do that, you're going to be better off. And keep your maintenance. Protect your investment. If I had to pick the one thing we should cut last, it would be training. If I had the second thing I would cut last, it would be maintenance. What are the first things we like to cut? Training and maintenance. You need well-trained people, and you need to maintain what you've got. We should really be cutting capital work first, okay? And keep good records. Good records will help you for liability purposes, of course, and will help you figure out what you actually have underneath the roadway, that you don't miss something. So one last question, then we'll do our PDHs and get you out of here. But let me ask you to raise your hand if you keep a daily log. How many of you keep a daily log? If you are working in the government sector, I absolutely recommend keeping a daily log. Okay? By the way, that daily log, if you truly just keep it for yourself, do not use it to do orders to send to people. You can hold that from a FOIL request. Once you use it for giving orders, however, it's foilable. So keep that in mind. It's a personal log. But you could use it in court. Of course, once it's brought out in court, then the whole thing is foilable. So keep that in mind as well. So you could keep weather and certain other things in daily records. But have records. Because somebody asked you what you had for lunch a year ago. Do you really know? What was the weather a year ago? You could look it up, but if you've written it down, you have a more specific forecast. You know who was on the crew, and it can help you a lot. Okay? So let's do our PDH questions and last few reminders. Let's see how we do here, and more importantly, how did I do? What percentage of goods are transported by truck? Very good. Yes, 70%. 70%. Okay? Yes, it will vary by community, but a lot of our goods get on a truck at some point. How many car passes are needed to do the damage of one fully loaded truck? Yeah, very good as well. A lot. 4 to 6,000. Okay? Now, obviously, it varies on the type of truck, but the point is when we're designing the geometry, we're looking at all the vehicles, radiuses, number of cars. But when designing thickness, think about your trucks, think about your farm equipment, think about the heavier vehicles. And what is the perception reaction time that we need to use to deal with making sure people are safe? Most of us react in the 1.5 seconds, but for design, you're right. We need to think about 2.5 seconds. Again, to be a little conservative, because at the end of the day, we all want to get home safely every single day. Okay? We want good roads. Good road can be gravel, it can be paved, it can be brick, it can be wood, but a good road really helps. So remember why we build the roadways, and everybody will be better off. Okay? Now, again, our foundational webinars. This week was Basics of Good Road. Next week, we're going to get into a lot more details about traffic safety, and we hope to see you at our other webinars. And we are continuing our road safety series. And then this Thursday, we're talking about proven countermeasures. And with that, we have about a minute. I'll give it back to you. I'll let you have a great day. Um, if you have any questions, anything in the Q&A, got one last chance for questions. If you got a question for us, we'll give you about 15 seconds. And if not, and I'm going to raise my hands, watch this, it's going to be magic. I'm going to say goodbye. Oh, hang on. How do you get the printout? There's those in the chat pod. You can send us an email, or you can send me an email, or you can go on our website. We'll get you the handout with all the resources. Um, and it will also be posted along with a copy of this webinar on our website, NYSLTAP.org. With that, everybody have yourself a great week, a great day, and I actually like the fact that it's raining. We need it here. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.